surprising geography of gun violence. Welcome. This is the English Language Learning Podcast. Today's episode is from a article on the internet. You can find the reading, a leitura na descrição, nas canais do YouTube. Todos os vídeos têm uma descrição que tem a leitura, vocabulário, perguntas e conversa que você pode usar para praticar seu inglês. So, let's start. The surprising geography of gun violence. America's regions are poles apart when it comes to gun deaths and the cultural and ideological forces that drive them. This is by Colin Woodard. Listen to the Southern right talk about violence in America, and you'd think New York City was as dangerous as Bakhmut on Ukraine's eastern front. In October, Florida Republican Governor Ron DeSantis proclaimed crime in New York was out of control and blamed it on George Soros. Another Sunshine State political, former President Donald Trump offered his native city up as a Democrat-run dystopia. One of those places where the middle class used to flock to live the American dream are now war zones. Literal war zones. In May 2022, In May 2022, hours after 19 children were murdered at Robb Elementary in Uvalde, Texas, Republican Governor Greg Abbott swatted back suggestions that the state could save lives by implementing tougher gun laws by proclaiming Chicago and LA and New York disprove that thesis. In reality, the region the Big Apple comprises most of is far and away the safest of the United States mainland when it comes to gun violence, while the regions Florida and Texas belong to have per capita firearm deaths, homicides and suicides, 3 to 4 times higher than New York. On a regional basis, it's the southern swath of the country in cities and rural areas alike where the rate of deadly gun violence is most acute, regions where Republicans have dominated state governments for decades. That is all I will read. There's much more detail. There's a lot of details and analysis about different regions in the United States, not just East, Midwest and West or South. No. They have big areas of land that are not exactly conventional that they describe and that they break down and investigate the history, right? The deep history of colonial history and everything that happened after, and the people groups that exist from the colonial time or pre-colonial times to the present day, and kind of how the origin story of each region can help us understand the relationship with guns and gun violence. So some other details. Again, I'm not reading anymore, but some other details. Gun laws, they mention gun laws come from gun culture, which comes from broader culture. Different regions of the U.S. have very different origins, original European histories, and values. Some brought from Europe and others, they came from unique American experiences. For example, the American South was settled or was inhabited by more wealthy, richer, land-owning classes of people that had a high value on honor and protecting honor and violence, using violence to protect honor. Also, slave economies and the use of violence, harsh violence, to enforce the slave economy. That doesn't mean just slaves either. Anyone who is helping slaves escape, slaves and their families, separating families violently, and enforcing slave rules violently. The far northern regions, or the North, again, in this article, they do not just call the North the North. They have particular sub-regions and areas. So it's not just, north of D.C., Washington, D.C. No, it's a little bit more particular. But the far northern regions had a puritanical, ultra-religious pursuit of self-doubt, autodúvida. I think that's how you say that in Portuguese. And collective cause. The collective was important. And violence was ultimately viewed or received and perceived as incompatible with the religion they practice, which was it was extreme, the religion they practice, but in some aspects, right, extreme Puritanism, which would exclude violence. There and they use violence, but we're talking about in the community. Indigenous people would not be in the community, so you can use violence on indigenous people and natives, but not on each other, because we practice the religion and we have rules, because we are civilized and we understand the love of God and the Bible, and violence was not okay to people in the community. So this is a great article. I recommend looking at it. If you ever wonder and think, why, and this could be done in Brazil. I would love to see this type of analysis in Brazil. But if you ever wonder, I wonder this as an American, why are guns it's such a sensitive topic in some areas and to some people. Some people who don't even have guns, it's a sensitive topic. The using of violence to protect honor. In California, that culture does not exist. In California, you do not find a culture of people worried about their honor and protecting their honor. No, it's a foreign concept to Californians, to Westerners in the far west in the U.S. And I believe in the article they use the description of the far west as going from San Diego, even I think part of Mexico they include, all the way up to Washington and Vancouver in Canada. So that is all for the reading. Coming up next, vocab and all things English. The surprising geography of gun violence. That was the title of the article we read by Colin Woodard. It gave us a short introduction. I read a short introduction. Você pode encontrar a leitura na descrição, no canal do YouTube. Todos os vídeos têm uma leitura. Now, all things English. So let's start from the very beginning. The subtitle: America's regions are poles apart. Poles apart. Very different. Poles, like the North Pole and the South Pole. So poles apart would be north and south. As far as you can be. America's regions are poles apart when it comes to gun deaths and the cultural and ideological forces that drive them. Forces that drive them. This would be the combustível, right? The things that are causing something. So to drive something is conduzir, impulsionar algo. To proclaim something. DeSantis proclaimed. This is in the first paragraph, I believe. In October, Florida's Republican Governor Ron DeSantis proclaimed crime in New York City is out of control and blamed it on George Soros, a rich Jewish man in the U.S. that receives a lot of conspiracy theory. To proclaim something is proclamar algo. To blame someone or something is to culpar alguém. I don't know why. This is not all things English, this comment, but George Soros, rich man, Jewish man, American man, not the most rich, bad English, not the richest person in the United States, but man, this guy's name is very common to hear, and conspiracy theories about child molestation, about corruption, and I don't know what he believes or feels when he hears this stuff, but it is very common. Google George Soros, and you'll find this. I imagine his Wikipedia page has a long list of conspiracy theories involving his name. So, to flock, Flock, to flock. First big paragraph, the Donald Trump part. President Trump offered his native city up as a democratic dystopia, one of those places where the middle class used to flock to live the American dream. To flock. Think of cabras. Think of a big group of an animal. When they're all moving in one direction, we call it a flock, but they are flocking to one area, right? We use flock with people when there's a lot of people going in one direction. Like this, the middle class flocking to live the American dream in these cities. Donald Trump is calling them war zones. So, to comprise, the region comprises. To comprise, this is the final paragraph that I read. In reality, the region, the Big Apple, New York, comprises most of, is far and away the safest part of the U.S. So, to comprise, I hate how they wrote this. Eu odio como eles escreveu isso. But to comprise is consistir. So the Big Apple, New York, is, again, in this article, they made a region. They created a region, and they gave it a name. I think it was the northern regions. And New York is part of that region. So part of. The region the Big Apple is part of is far and away the safest part of the U.S. Far and away, seja longe, o mais seguro. E de longe o mais seguro região. The mainland, o continente, right? The United States has islands, Hawaii, we have Alaska, which is, disconnected. So when we talk about the mainland, we have Puerto Rico as well, which is not a state, but it is part of the United States. But it's not part of the mainland. One word, mainland, continente. The part of the United States that's all touching and connected, not the islands or other places far away. Swath. On a regional basis, it's southern swath of the country. Swath would be a big region, a big area, a chunk. Região. And I think our last vocab word here is in the same sentence. In cities and rural areas, áreas rurais, rural areas alike, where the rate, a taxa, of deadly gun violence, de violência das armas, is most acute. A-C-U-T-E, acute. Not fofo, fofinho, no, not cute, acute, which would mean agudo, sharp. Onde a taxa de violência é mais aguda. Agudo, not agudo. That's all. Coming up next, questions and conversation about gun violence and the geography of gun violence. And where does gun violence happen? And what are some things that we can observe from our statistical, numbers about where does this stuff happen? People talk about gun violence all the time. It's very easy to have an opinion about gun violence. It's very uncomfortable to actually look at the numbers and realities of gun violence and have a conversation not full of opinions, but, kind of thinking about, wow, okay, this is the reality. Now let's think about that instead of starting with our thoughts and then going to the numbers. Now let's start with the numbers and then break down, which basically this entire article is that. It takes a database of numbers of gun violence, also the history of gun violence, and it combines the two. In the history of the United States, really, it combines the two to try and explain why does gun violence happen in some areas to some people, into some communities, and in others it's quite different. There's not really a common ground or a denominador común between gun violence in Florida and gun violence in San Francisco. Coming up next, the surprising geography of gun violence. A geografia surpreendente da violência das armas. Ou violência armada, né? Acho que pode ser os dois. Question number 1. What are the narratives around gun violence in your region? What about in Brazil as a whole? In Portuguese, o que são as narrativas sobre violência armada no seu região? E no Brasil inteiramente? What are people saying? And this is not about the numbers. This is about what are people saying. If I go to a bar and have a beer and start talking to someone as a foreigner, como estrangeiro, perguntando, pode descrever a violência armada no seu região, no seu país? O que você está vendo, o que você está percebendo, o que você está observando, o que eles ou elas provavelmente vão falar. What are the narratives? What do people think is happening? And what are they hearing from the news frequently, right? In the United States, you can listen to different people talk about gun violence. And again, this is in the article, a leitura que eu li, a introdução no começo do episódio. If you listen to different voices on TV or walk into a bar in the United States and you have a beer and say, hey man, I hear that the United States has gun violence. What do you say? What do you know? What do you see? You're going to get very different answers. And I'm not saying, one is correct and one is wrong, or I'm not saying that people can't have their feelings and thoughts. Of course you can. It's a free country up there, free country down here, right? But you will get a very different view of the country. And I think that is the point of the article. You can't talk about gun violence in the United States and make general conclusions or generalizations. The only generalizable thing in gun violence in the entire United States are guns. Besides the guns, a partir de isso, a partir das armas, no. The conversations and the realities about gun violence are very different. Not to mention just one factor. Are they suicides or are they homicides? So gun violence is not a simple topic to have a general narrative. But I'm interested. What are the narratives in Brazil about gun violence? What do people say about it? Number 2, and sorry about my voice. I am getting sick. I can barely breathe, and it might sound awful. I don't know. I haven't listened back to this yet, but I apologize. Are you afraid of gun violence in your neighborhood? Se você tem medo de violência armada no seu bairro, are you afraid of gun violence wherever you are right now in your neighborhood? Am I? Not gun violence. I am afraid of the ameaça de violência no meu bairro. But my neighborhood is not a dangerous neighborhood. And the narrative of gun violence in my neighborhood is it doesn't happen. You might get robbed or shot. That would be gun violence. You might get robbed or threatened or assaulted, but it's very unlikely statistically to be a victim of gun violence in my neighborhood now. What about your neighborhood? Not the numbers, not the statistics. Are you afraid of it? Just a very simple yes or no. You do not have to explain more. This is simply your feelings. Are you afraid of gun violence in your neighborhood? How would you try and explain the difference between school shootings and gang violence? Como você como você tentaria explicar a diferença entre tiroteios nas escolas e violência de traficantes or gangs? How would you try and explain the difference? And this is not necessarily thinking about Brazil or the US, just the ideas, the topics, right? School shootings happen. Unfortunately, most of them are in my country, the United States, but they happen, and gang violence happens. And in my country, the first question, what are the narratives around gun violence? In my country, these are the narratives: gang violence, Chicago, Baltimore, Maryland, Oakland. It's people killing themselves in their own communities with guns that they use and buy illegally. And then the other narrative is, well, people are politically crazy and they take guns and they go into schools and shoot kids because they're angry, young men. And I don't mean to say by accident young men. No, it's always young men. Very rarely is it a woman, although I'm reading this today. It's the 10th of June, 2023. Just 2 days ago, a white woman in, I imagine it was Florida, but I don't remember the state. I think it was Florida. An older white woman shot to death a black mother outside of the white woman's home after 2 years of, being a racist C word, being a racist person and having fights with the black woman about the black woman's child and, kind of a neighbor dispute. But racism was a frequent, was frequent in their interactions. But it was a woman, and the victim was a woman too. Other narratives: women are usually the victim, not the perpetrators of gun violence. In school shootings or in gang violence, it doesn't matter. Both of those are men doing the shooting. Could you try and think of some commonalities that exist between all types of gun violence? So there's suicides, there's gang violence, there's drug trafficking violence, there's honor killings, right? If you go to, let's go outside of the Americas, into India or Pakistan, or in a very conservative Muslim country, or even India, not Muslim, but in India, there are honor killings that are not about drugs. Now, these are about, and this is horrible, but people get killed because of being raped. Not the rapist, but people who are the victim. And I'm not mentioning this, with respect to gun violence, but what are the other types of violence and gun violence? There are domestic violence shootings, right, where a man will kill his spouse. And again, most of the people who use guns to kill people are men. But what are some of the commonalities? Se você poderia tentar e pensar de algumas commonalidades que existem entre todos os tipos de violência armada. Do you think Brazilians will follow Americans? Hopefully not. Do you think Brazilians will follow Americans down the path of passively allowing guns to proliferate in the country? Se você acha que os brasileiros vão seguir os americanos do norte no caminho de passivamente permitindo armas proliferar ou espalhar no país? Bolsonaro has already contributed to that. But what do you think? I'm not talking about the politicians. I'm just talking about the people. Same question. If I go to a bar and I'm having a beer as a tourist and I start asking people, with a smile on my face, com sorriso, só de conversar, hey, what do you guys think about owning a gun? Have you ever wanted to own a gun? Are you interested in owning a gun? Do you think a gun would make you safer? Do you think Brazilians should have the ability and the right to shoot guns in a shooting club for recreation, for fun? Where do you think Brazilians should be allowed to keep their guns? In a car? in a locked box in the house, in the shooting club? What are people gonna say? And do you think their answers and their opinions will be similar to America, where basically, depending on the region, you may have people tell you, yeah, you should be able to have a gun hiding in your pants with no permit, no training, no certificate, no list that has your name. Oh, he's a gun owner. You can carry it in your car. You can take it with you to your kid's school, in the hospital, in the library, anywhere and everywhere. Have a gun, and then you'll end up in places where people think, no, there's no reason to have a gun unless you're going to go hunting, para caçar, animal para comer, or you want to have a gun, yeah, sure, whatever. But if you have a problem or you witness a crime, you call the police. You don't. Guns are not for safety. Guns are for fun. So, next question. What are your thoughts generally about responsible gun ownership? O que são seus pensamentos sobre propriedade das armas responsáveis? What do you think about responsible gun ownership? What do you think? Not what does Brazil think? What do your neighbors think? What do your friends think? No. This is about you now. What are your thoughts, pensamentos, crenças, beliefs about responsible gun ownership? Is it possible to live in a country where you can own guns and also be a responsible gun owner? Or is all propriedade das armas irresponsável? Or somewhere in the middle? But what do you think? A majority of gun deaths in the U.S. are suicides. That's another part of the narrative that people don't respect. Both people who want gun control and more gun restriction, and people who want no gun restrictions. A maioridade das morridos das armas nos Estados Unidos são suicídios. Como isso afeta a sua opinião sobre a natureza de violência armada? So, suicide is not an excluding factor, right? Oh, it's suicide, so we shouldn't restrict gun ownership. Não deveríamos restringir propriedade das armas por culpa das pessoas que são suicidando. Como se fala isso em português? They're committing suicide. So I don't want to kill myself, so I should be able to hold and keep a gun without any restrictions, or with some restrictions, whatever. But suicide is not for me, so I don't think someone else being suicidal should affect my freedom. You're going to hear that a lot in the United States in the narratives about gun violence. Hey, someone's depressed, they want to kill themselves, no problem, go do it. Use a gun, I don't care. It's not my problem. It's not my gun. And then you have people on the left, that don't respect the nature of gun violence. A lot of it is suicide. And so if you focus on school shootings and gang violence and domestic violence, and you focus on that as the issue, someone's going to say, well, violent homicide is actually decreasing, maybe a little bit increasing since the pandemic, and that's a very special time period, natural experiment, more or less. But hey, you think that gun violence is so bad in the U.S., it's actually decreasing, está diminuindo. O que você vai falar para isso, né? Você está tão assustado das notícias, mas você não pode ficar pensando e observando que, no país, a taxa de violência com armas armadas diminuindo. But what about suicides? There is research. There are research? No, there is research that suicide and suicidal people is a moment. It's something that happens in a moment, an intense, depressing moment of hopelessness, right? And if you don't allow people to successfully kill themselves or terminate or commit suicide, then you can save them. Maybe they stay depressed. Maybe they have a lifelong battle with depression, but they're alive. So what do you think about suicides and gun violence? How does that change your opinion? I don't know the numbers in Brazil, but in the U.S., most of the gun deaths that happen are suicides. And you cannot talk about gun violence in the United States without mentioning and respecting that fact. This is not just about school shootings. This is not just about gang violence. This is not just about domestic violence. This is about a country of people who are depressed, who are big and fat and not happy. And they're using guns to kill themselves. Again, mostly men too. So what does that mean? How do we interpret that information? Why do I think this matters to Brazilians? Brazil and the USA are global leaders in gun violence. We have very different gun laws and very different cultures with respect to gun ownership. The narrative, false or real, around gun violence has traditionally been a very powerful political football used to influence voters in elections. If Brazil has any doubts about what happens with increased gun ownership, just look up. Look up. Look at the United States. That's what happens when you basically say no rules, guns everywhere, no restriction. If Brazil wants to keep children safe from young white neo-Nazi men, don't follow our lead. If Brazil wants to maintain civility and avoid people getting shot for knocking on the wrong door, don't follow our lead. If Brazil doesn't want to have a large group of depressed people successfully killing themselves, don't follow our lead. Basically, don't follow our lead. Have rules. Go slow. Don't jump in this debate, in this discussion, because the use of a gun for violence is final. When you shoot someone, you're probably going to kill them. That is all. This is the English Language Learning Podcast.